He served his country with honor, fighting for freedom, abroad, only to be gunned down on his own doorstep by a man sworn to protect it. But when the cop pulled the trigger, he didn't just take a shot, he rewrote the story. In court, the truth was twisted, and what the judge did next left an entire courtroom gasping in disbelief. James Parker had spent most of his adult life in uniform, fighting wars in foreign lands, risking everything to defend the freedoms that many take for granted. After serving 2 honorable tours overseas, he finally returned home, looking forward to peace, family, and rebuilding a quiet life. James moved into a modest house in a working-class neighborhood just outside Atlanta. Despite the visible scars of war and the weight of trauma that only veterans truly understand, James remained a calm, soft-spoken man who volunteered at the local community center and worked nights at the VA hospital helping other veterans. His neighbors knew him as Doc, even though he wasn't a doctor, just someone always willing to help. One cold January night, James had just finished his shift and returned home wearing a heavy army green jacket, his military backpack slung across his shoulder. He didn't notice the nervous glances from a new neighbor as he walked from his car to his front porch. That neighbor, unfamiliar with James, called 911 and reported a suspicious black man in military gear trying to break into a house. Within minutes, a squad car screeched up to the curb. Officer Brent Holloway stepped out, hand already hovering over his gun. James turned, surprised by the flashing lights, and walked slowly down his steps with his hands visible. "This is my house," James said calmly, pointing at the porch. "I live here. I just got home from work." But Officer Holloway wasn't listening. His training, or perhaps his fear, kicked in. He began shouting commands, conflicting and rushed. "Don't move, hands up, get on the ground." James froze, confused, still trying to explain. "I'm a veteran. I live here," he repeated. Louder now. Holloway shouted again. "I said, get down." James slowly lowered one knee to the ground, his hand still raised. Then, in a sudden moment that would change everything, Holloway pulled the trigger. The shot rang through the quiet street, sending neighbors rushing to their windows. James collapsed on the ground, clutching his side, blood pooling beneath him. His voice was barely a whisper. "Why? I didn't do anything." Body cam footage, which should have captured the entire interaction, cut off just seconds before the shooting. The official report from Holloway stated that James lunged forward aggressively, and he feared for his life, but no weapon was found on James. Witnesses insisted they saw him standing calmly, hands raised. Still, Holloway walked away from the scene that night, while James was rushed to the hospital with a bullet lodged near his spine. News of the incident spread quickly, sparking protests and calls for justice. Veteran shot on his own porch made headlines. But deeper than the outrage was heartbreak. How could a man who survived war overseas come home only to be shot on his doorstep by the very system he defended? James, now paralyzed from the waist down, faced the toughest battle of his life. But he was determined this time to fight for justice. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, activists, neighbors, and strangers filled every bench, their eyes locked on the man in the wheelchair, James Parker, the veteran whose quiet life had been shattered by a single gunshot from a man in uniform. The trial of Officer Brent Holloway had begun, and tension buzzed in the air like electricity before a storm. James sat still, his face calm but his hands clenched tightly. He had survived war zones and hospital wards, but nothing prepared him for the emotional battlefield of a courtroom where truth could be twisted and justice wasn't guaranteed. Brent Holloway entered the courtroom with his head bowed and a carefully rehearsed look of remorse on his face. His legal team painted him as a dedicated officer who responded to a dangerous situation with instinct, not malice. They told the jury he had received a 911 call describing a suspicious man in a threatening stance. "My client feared for his life," the defense attorney said, again and again, like a mantra. They leaned into the narrative that Brent was just doing his job in a tense, unpredictable moment. But James's team had come prepared. They played the partial body cam footage, the moments before it mysteriously cut off. In the video, James stood still, hands raised, calm and composed. There was no lunge, no threat, no reason to shoot. "Why did the camera cut off just before the trigger was pulled?" asked the prosecutor, turning to the jury. "What are they trying to hide?" James's attorney brought in witnesses who lived on the street. They testified that James was never aggressive. He was calm. One elderly neighbor said, tears in her eyes. "He just kept saying, 'I live here.'" Others spoke of the officer's past behavior, aggressive conduct, frequent complaints of racial profiling, a reputation for escalating situations instead of diffusing them. Still, the defense clung to one idea, that Brent had only a few seconds to act, and those seconds were clouded by fear. Then Brent took the stand. He cried, wiped his eyes, and told the jury how scared he was. He said James made a sudden movement, that it all happened too fast. Some jurors nodded, visibly moved, but James didn't blink. He knew the difference between real fear and a performance. He'd seen it on the battlefield. That the trial dragged on for days. Protests continued outside the courthouse, people carrying signs that read, "Hands up, don't shoot," and "Justice for James." Inside, legal arguments twisted facts into shapes that suited their purpose. James gave his testimony with quiet dignity, describing how he felt his body go numb, how he feared he would die on his own front porch for doing absolutely nothing wrong. Still, doubt lingered. The jury seemed torn, unsure whether to believe a crying officer or a silent clip of video that ended too soon. Just when it felt like justice might slip away, the judge made a move that would change everything and reveal the truth that had been hidden in the shadows all along. The final day of the trial felt heavy with expectation. Rain tapped against the courthouse windows as people filed in, the air thick with tension. James sat quietly near the front, his hands resting on the arms of his wheelchair, his face unreadable. Across the room, Officer Brent Holloway looked nervous, no longer wearing the mask of calm confidence he had maintained throughout the trial. The jury had been deliberating for hours, and everyone was bracing for what might be a painful conclusion. Some feared the truth would be buried beneath legal technicalities, that once again the system would side with the badge over the man. But no one was prepared for what happened next. Before the jury returned, Judge Renee Caldwell cleared her throat and asked for silence. She held a folder in her hands, thick with documents, her face serious but strangely resolute. "Before we proceed," she said, "this court has a responsibility to ensure justice is not only heard, but seen." The room fell into stunned silence. She explained that, without public knowledge, she had authorized an independent forensic analysis of the officer's body cam footage, an act rarely done mid-trial, but one she deemed necessary due to inconsistencies and missing timeframes. Then came the shock. The footage had been tampered with. The forensic team recovered the missing few seconds, just enough to change everything. In the recovered clip, James was clearly shown with both hands in the air, calmly saying, "Please don't shoot. This is my home." There was no sudden movement, no threat. Just a man, exhausted after a long shift, trying to survive in a world that didn't always see his humanity. And then, without warning, the shot rang out. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the video played. Some people wept, others covered their mouths in disbelief. Brent's attorney turned pale. Brent himself slumped in his chair, eyes wide with the realization that his carefully constructed version of events had just crumbled. Judge Caldwell looked directly at Brent Holloway. "This court finds your actions not only reckless but intentionally deceptive. You shot an innocent man, then you lied, and you almost got away with it." Her voice didn't rise, but its power shook the room. She declared Brent guilty of attempted murder, obstruction of justice, and tampering with evidence. The jury, stunned by the turn of events, nodded in agreement. Brent was immediately taken into custody. James didn't speak as the courtroom erupted. In emotion, some cheering, some crying. He sat still, tears quietly rolling down his face. Not tears of revenge, but of relief. For once, the truth had won. Outside, people gathered in the rain, holding signs high and embracing strangers. James eventually rolled out the doors, greeted by applause and chants of his name. He had fought for his country, and now he had fought for justice and won. Though he would never walk again, his story would stand as a powerful reminder. Justice delayed doesn't always mean justice denied. And sometimes, even in a broken system, the truth finds a way to rise. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to The Black Struggle for more powerful stories that demand to be heard.